Nehemiah was King Artaxerxes' cupbearer. And I believe you've heard that 3 times, but hopefully this time it'll stick. We've already kind of covered these a little bit on Nehemiah. But he was the cupbearer. So he had a very important job, and that job is to keep the king from getting poisoned. And you would want to be friends with the guy that kept you from being poisoned, which that to me, that's why I felt like, well, maybe that's why Artaxerxes and Nehemiah they seemed to be friends. Because whenever Nehemiah came in after he heard the news about the walls being down and the gates being burned, the king actually noticed the cupbearer and how he was acting. And I find that interesting because most kings would be like, get rid of him. I want a happy guy in here giving me my drink. But so either way, they had a close relationship. And whenever Nehemiah found out that Jerusalem was in the shape that it was in, Hananiah had told him that. And whenever Hananiah told him, he said it was a trouble and a disgrace of his people. That was kind of the wording that he used. And that bothered Nehemiah. And I know people are wired different. Some people, when you tell your problems to them, they're like, get over it. I'm usually that guy. Get over it. But you have some people, when you tell them their problem, they think of ways to fix. And those are the cool people. Those are the people you need, the people that go out of their way. But the book of Nehemiah is a story about a man who was informed of an enormous job, and he volunteered for the task. Nobody asked him to do it, but he volunteered for that job. People were returning to Jerusalem. The wall of the city was still destroyed, and the gates had been burned. Whenever you look at the book of Nehemiah, this is kind of an overview of the book. A little more in detail than I'm used to. I usually give you like 4 points that you can remember, but pretty much broke down by chapter. But you can see that Nehemiah gets permission to rebuild the walls in Jerusalem from Artaxerxes. He gets the materials that he needs for permission to get those things. He looks at the walls or surveys them when he gets there. The construction begins on the walls in chapter 3. Chapter 4, when things are going good, you've always got enemies there trying to do bad and to slow you down. Chapter 5, we see Nehemiah addressing the pressure on the poor. The wall is completed in chapter 6, and then Nehemiah numbers the people in chapter 7. And I look at these things like chapter 1 through 7, that's the easy stuff. It's easy just getting to build something, ain't it? Whenever you get in chapters 8 through 13, you're looking at Nehemiah trying to change the mind of the people and getting them to want to be good people, to want to be people that obey the Lord. It's hard to change people's mind, isn't it? Because I know we've all talked to different people several times, sometimes about the same subject over and over again. It's hard to change the mind of people. But what's so important about a wall? Because that's what it gets down to. Chapters 1 through 7, we're talking about building a wall, okay? Walls at this time in history were for protection. I get that. We might not get that now. We don't usually have walls and gates and fences. We have fences to keep kids out of the road. But we don't worry about protection and those things. But at this time, walls were for protection. They were safe zones. They promoted peace. Those early walls didn't just reduce violence by simply deterring invasion by an outside party, but the security afforded by the walls made the inhabitants accustomed to peace. They were used to peace. Great attention is devoted to the rebuilding of the walls around Jerusalem because Jerusalem was the spiritual and political center of Judah. And without walls, Jerusalem could hardly be considered a city at all. It wouldn't be, especially at that time, or it wouldn't be long without walls. And God's faithfulness to his people is highlighted by the extensive narrative of the rebuilding of the walls. The rebuilding was accomplished despite considerable odds against it. The Samaritans and Ammonites tried everything that they could to make the people stop. because they didn't want this to continue. And despite overwhelming difficulties, the rebuilding was completed in 52 days. And that's a huge task. And even Nehemiah's enemies conceded that this work was from God. And Nehemiah chapter 6, verses 15 and 16, so the wall was finished on the 25th day of Elul in 52 days. And it happened when our enemies heard of it and all the nations around us, that these things, that they were very disheartened in their own eyes, for they perceived that this work was done by our God. So they could not have done that without the Lord on their side. And I don't believe that we can talk about Nehemiah without at least mentioning his leadership ability. He had leadership ability. In the 21 indisputable qualities of a leader, there are various qualities that relate closely to the type of perseverance we see in Nehemiah. 3 qualities that especially stand out are his commitment to the cause of rebuilding the wall, no matter what stood in his way. And he also wanted to convince the people to serve the Lord. He was committed to that task. Nehemiah had courage. He faced internal and external threats head on, and he had passion. Usually you follow a passionate person. You can especially follow a passionate person that delivers like Nehemiah did. And he did. He delivered one time after another. And that's what's interesting whenever you're reading through the book. Anytime there's a problem, Nehemiah, we have a tendency when there's a problem, we're just like, maybe if I just ignore it for a bit, it'll go away. Right? We're accustomed to that. We do that. Maybe it'll just go away. Nehemiah's like, no, I'm just going to punch it in the face. And he would sit down and he would talk to the people. And he would tell them, hey, this is what I see. I don't like it. You need to fix it. And that's what was great about the book of Nehemiah. So Nehemiah faced internal conflict. We'll look at, if that doesn't match what I have on my sheet, we'll just leave that there until we get there. But Nehemiah faced internal conflict. In Nehemiah chapter 5, if you want to turn there, I'm not going to read through all this, but I want you to know where to go whenever we're talking about it. But right here, Nehemiah finds out that his own countrymen are charging interest to the workers. This is their own countrymen. And under the law in Deuteronomy, you could not charge usury or interest to your brothers. And that's exactly what these people were doing. The leaders of the community, the elite, the people that had the stuff, they're pretty much starving the workers. They need grain to eat so that they can be fueled, so they can go to work. But these people are charging, they're mortgaging their homes, they're mortgaging their fields, they're mortgaging their olive groves. They're mortgaging off each other, individuals. They're slaves, some of them. And they go to Nehemiah and they're like, hey, this is what's happening. We just want to eat so we can finish the job. And Nehemiah had a problem with that. So Nehemiah gathers together all the nobles and the rulers, and he lets them know that this isn't right. And he tells them, hey, I'm feeding these people too, but I'm not charging anything. I'm just feeding them. And he tells them they need to give back the fields, the vineyards, the olive groves, the homes, the slaves. Anything you've taken as collateral, you give back. The nobles readily promised him that they would do this, but that wasn't enough for Nehemiah. This is my favorite part, because they were like, yeah, we'll do that. We'll do that. And Nehemiah takes it a little step further. He called the priests to him, and he required the nobles to swear publicly in front of everyone that they would stop their greedy practices. And the whole assembly agreed, and they praised the Lord, and the people did as they promised. He called them on it. And they did what they were supposed to. And a lot of it was because they had a group of people behind them that said, remember when you promised that? You're not supposed to do that anymore. All right, so that's the internal conflict that he dealt with. External conflict, we look at chapter 4. And we'll just read verses 1 through 4. But it so happened when Sanballat heard that they were rebuilding the wall that he was furious and very indignant and mocked the Jews, and he spoke before his brethren in the army of Samaria and said, what are these feeble Jews doing? Will they fortify themselves? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they complete in a day? Will they revive the stones from the heap of rubbish, stones that are burned? Now Tobiah, the Ammonite, I want you to remember that name, because we got Tobiah the Ammonite comes up again a little later. So remember, Tobiah the Ammonite Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him and said, "Whatever they build, if even a fox goes upon it, he will break it down, their stone wall." It's like, burn, after he says that. That's an old school burn right there. He says they're not very good at building walls. He says, Hear, O God, for we are despised. Turn their reproach on their own heads and give them as plunder to a land of captivity. Do not cover their iniquity, and do not let their sin be blotted out before you. For they have proved that you to anger before the builders. So we built the wall. The entire wall was joined together up to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. Now it happened when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites heard the walls of Jerusalem were being restored, and the gaps were beginning to be closed, that they became very angry. And all of them conspired together to come and attack Jerusalem and create confusion. Nevertheless, we made our prayers to our God, and because of them, we set a watch against them day and night. Then Judah said, "The strength of the laborers is failing, and there's so much rubbish that we're not able to build the wall." So this is the external threats that he's having to deal with. These people are trying to disrupt the work that they're doing. And, that's not really, it's a roadblock for Nehemiah, because he's a guy that's just like, okay, you pick up a sword and you build a wall. This is what we're going to do. We're going to build a wall, and you're going to defend your buddy. And they continue on. And although Nehemiah faced challenges with rebuilding the wall, people wanted to harm or kill him. That was really the easy work. Giving people work and a purpose is easy because this will be their home. I kind of look at it like sweat equity. It doesn't bother you to go home and work on your projects, does it? I love working on my projects. Guess what? They're my projects. And when you come to my house, you look at my projects. But I don't want to work on yours. And I think it's the same thing. It's a little sweat equity. They want to make Jerusalem habitable again. So the real challenge is in changing the hearts of the people. And that's what we're going to talk about the rest of the lesson. These people were spiritually bankrupt. They were captive people that had been around pagan practices for the last 70 years. They had no symbol of hope, but now they do have a hope. They have a homeland with a wall around it, so they have a city. But the hard part's to educate the people. When you get to Nehemiah chapter 8, we're going to read verses 8 through 12. It says, "So they read distinctly from the book in the law of God, and they gave the sense and helped them to understand the reading. And Nehemiah, who was the governor, Ezra the priest and scribe, and the Levites who taught the people, said to all the people, 'This day is holy to the Lord your God. Do not mourn nor weep.' For all the people wept when they heard the words of the law. Then he said to them, 'Go your way, eat the fat, drink the sweet, and send the portions of those for whom nothing is prepared, for this day is holy to our Lord. Do not sorrow, for the joy of the Lord is your strength.' So the Levites quieted all the people, saying, 'Be still, for the day is holy. Do not be grieved.' And all the people went their way to eat and to drink, to send portions and rejoice greatly, because they understood the words that were declared to them." That's the first thing we have to do whenever we're reading the Bible, isn't it? We have to understand. Well, they understood. And whenever we get to Nehemiah chapter 9, you think as a reader, you can go ahead and turn there if you want. I don't believe I have anything to read from there. Just kind of tell you what's going on. When you get to Nehemiah chapter 9, you think as a reader that Nehemiah and Ezra have got this thing whipped. They've done a great job, and these people have changed their minds. The people assembled together in chapter 9. They assembled together fasting. They're in sackcloth. They've already thrown dirt on themselves as a sign of grief. So they realize their position. They realize what they've done. They confessed their sins and the sins of their fathers. The law of God was read for a quarter of the day. They spent another quarter of the day in confession and worshiping. They have a list of leaders that signed a written covenant to serve God faithfully. They even specified certain things that they would do. But we've seen this before, haven't we, with the children of Israel, all the way back to Mount Sinai. They say, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, and we're going to serve God. But what do? They don't. They don't serve God. It's just lip service. So Nehemiah goes back to King Artaxerxes. Nehemiah leaves the scene, I guess you would say, for a minute. So this is the question I guess we'll finish with. Where's Israel in terms of restoration by the end of the book of Nehemiah? And I believe that we can see that in chapter 11, or chapter 13 of Nehemiah. Sorry, chapter 13. In my mind, Israel is what they always were before. They were faithful when they got down and they got low and things were bad. They would say, Lord, Lord, help us, save us. They're fine. But whenever things got good again, by God. That's kind of, I feel like it's the same cycle over and over. So after 12 years in Jerusalem, Nehemiah returned to Artaxerxes the king. Then after some time, he returned to Jerusalem. I don't know exactly how much time that was that he was gone before he returned. Upon his return, he found out that Eliashib, the high priest, had taken one of the temple chambers and allowed Tobiah the Ammonite, you remember that guy? Remember all the bad stuff he tried to do? Well, the high priest had given him a chamber at the place, an apartment at the temple. Well, that's a problem. Ammonites and Moabites could not enter the assembly of Israel, and this guy's living there. So Nehemiah, of course, removes Tobiah's things, and he purifies the room. So that's no more. That's the first thing that he sees when he gets back. Nehemiah also discovered, this is the second thing, that a portion due to the Levites was not being brought in by the people. And this was one of the points specifically mentioned in the covenant they had made so recently, and they were breaking this promise very soon. The Levites could not do their work at the temple because they'd been forced to return to their fields and provide for their necessities. They have work to do at the temple, but they can't do it because people aren't giving like they're supposed to, so that they can go do that work. And Nehemiah rebuked the officials that he'd left in charge, and once again he got the system going again, and he prayed, just as Nehemiah always did. The third thing that he saw is another specific point in the covenant the people made is that they would keep the Sabbath law. In Nehemiah chapter 13, maybe I got this one there. Yeah. Nehemiah 13, 15 to 22. I just want to read this instead of telling you that part of the story. In those days, I saw people in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in sheaves and loading donkeys with wines, grapes, figs, and all kinds of burdens, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I warned them about the day on which they were selling provisions. Men of Tyre dwelt there also, who brought in fish and all kinds of goods and sold them on the Sabbath to the children of Judah and in Jerusalem. Then I contended with the nobles of Judah and said to them, what evil thing is this that you do, by which you profane the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers do thus, and did not our God bring all disaster on us and on this city? Yet you bring added wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath. So it was at the gates, as it began to be dark before the Sabbath, that I commanded the gates to be shut and charged that they must not be opened till after the Sabbath. Then I posted some of my servants at the gates, so that no burdens would be brought in on the Sabbath day. Now the merchants and sellers of all kinds of wares lodged outside Jerusalem once or twice. When I warned them, it said to them, why do you spend the night around the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands on you from this time. From that time on, they came no more on the Sabbath. And I commanded the Levites that they should cleanse themselves, and they should go and guard the gates to sanctify the Sabbath day. So that was the third thing that Nehemiah dealt with. And the next thing he dealt with is just Nehemiah 13, starting in verse 23. This is actually my favorite, all right? It's my favorite because his reaction. It says, in those days I also saw Jews who had married women of Ashad, Ammon, and Moab, and half their children spoke the language of Ashad and could not speak the language of Judah, but spoke according to the language of one or the other people. So I contended with them and cursed them, struck some of them, and pulled out their hair. You pulled out their hair? Are you kidding me? It's serious. I mean, we're looking, God wanted a consecrated people. God wanted a people that weren't mixed with all the other nations. They were their own particular race. And they're not doing it. And Nehemiah, he just had enough. I'm pulling their hair and smacking them. But that was the response. It says, you shall not give your daughters as wives to your sons, wives to their sons, nor take their daughters for your sons or yourselves? Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin by these things? Yet among many nations there was no king like him, who was beloved of his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, pagan women caused even him to sin. Should we then hear of your doing all this great evil, transgressing against our God by marrying pagan women? So he reacted. So in conclusion, this afternoon, after 70 years in exile, the Jews had returned home and rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem. They were able to worship God in their own land, but the city still lay in ruins whenever Nehemiah heard about this. It was exposed rubble, I guess you would call it. The walls were. So when Nehemiah hears about this, he makes supply preparations to get the job done. He works out a plan of attack to restore the city walls. And the book of Nehemiah is about reestablishing God's people both physically in chapters 1 through 7 and spiritually throughout the rest of the book. Although the governors of surrounding territories viciously opposed Nehemiah's efforts to rebuild the wall, he finished it in 52 days, which is a huge victory for God's people. Along the way, Nehemiah also seeks to restore economic justice in the land, admonishing the wealthy for taking advantage of their less fortunate brothers. And Nehemiah was sincere in his work. From the beginning, he determined to be a help to his people rather than a hindrance, and he did just that. And although Nehemiah and Ezra tried very hard to reform the people, they just half-heartedly served the Lord. And I was just going to put the indicators up here, because I don't feel like this lesson is one of those that there's a lot we can take home. But I think if you look at the indicators of the people, this is their mindset. Even though they declared in the earlier chapters that, we're for the Lord, we'll do exactly what the Lord says. We see by chapter 13, this is where they're at. And some of these indicators we could look at in our lives. This indicated that they weren't sold out to the Lord. Number one, they were not careful to provide for the priests and the Levites. So this is a giving issue for some people. It's a giving issue. Nor did it even disturb them when the temple services was stopped or hindered by the lack of workers. They really didn't care. That would be like us saying, we're not going to come together on Sunday evening or Wednesday evening. Sunday morning's enough. We don't have enough teachers. We don't have enough, you can make all excuses you want. But we should be here. We should be together every opportunity that we can. We look at the early church in the book of Acts. They were meeting daily. So, why wouldn't we want to do that? I sometimes we're pretty close to meeting daily, but I think that's a good indicator. And whenever we see that in our lives, maybe we need to take inventory. They did not care about each other. They took advantage of their own countrymen whenever they were charging usury or interest. That's not taking care of your brothers. If I see that you have a need, I should want to help you. I shouldn't enslave your children. But if you want to make that deal, I got a lot of rocks to pick up. So come on over. But that's not what we want. The third thing is they did not worry about keeping the Sabbath law carefully. And this indicates that they lacked the zeal to keep any of God's law. And that's the kind of people that they were. And we can be those kind of people too. And the fourth thing, they did not keep themselves separate from the neighboring people. They would not stay faithful if they intermarried with foreigners. And that's something that we saw Nehemiah definitely wanted them to do, but they didn't. And we should spend time whenever application. We should spend time with thinking about who we're going to spend the rest of our life with, who you spend your time with as far as your friends. I believe you can make that application with that right there. That's all I have this evening. Hopefully something was interesting or gave you a better understanding. I've enjoyed the Old Testament study. I think when Aaron gave me some of these topics, I was like, I don't want to do that. But I learned so much along the way, especially in these period of captivity and the return, because I didn't know a lot about that to begin with. We never close the service without offering an invitation. If you've never obeyed the gospel, or if you're a child of God that's gone astray and you need to make that make a correction, then please come as we stand and as we sing.
Thanks for watching this video. I know what you're thinking. I don't want to miss another video from this channel. In order to avoid that, click on the red button down there, subscribe, and then click the bell icon. Not only will that alert you each time a new video is uploaded to the channel, it will also help spread the channel to other people's awareness. So, go ahead, do it. Like right now, click on it.